And for that kind of introduction. Yeah. Okay. Okay, sure. And thanks to Penn State for having me. It's really good to be back. I can't believe it's been 20 years. I feel old, but we are young at heart, right, Brian? So it's really fantastic to see everyone, Paul, Helen, a lot of the people I had, Jean Sanders was out there as well. So this talk is organized into places and also sort of eureka moments. So when I was at the University of California, San Diego, my thesis committee chair, Jennifer Pastor, she said that when she went to artist talks, she didn't want to hear like every single piece they ever made and like, every little detail about that piece, but she really wanted to know the eureka moments. And so those aha moments for me were attached to places. So my work is a lot about like our attachment to place and how contemporary life forces us to sort of be these sort of global nomads. So, of course, the first place was here in Pennsylvania. I was born, raised, and went to school at Penn State, of course. And, every good artist talk should start off with like a really awkward photograph of someone. So this is me, a well-adjusted classic beauty who spent way too much time on her Apple IIe. And my dad in Harrisburg was a shop teacher. So he built my childhood home. He designed it, built all the furniture in it. So you'll see that sort of bubbles up in the work throughout my career. So as you know, I went to Penn State and it was sort of like a heyday in the painting department, as Anne just mentioned. Julie Heffernan was teaching here at the time. She was commuting from New York. Bob Yarber had just arrived from New York. He moved here. And then Paul and Helen. It was just this amazing group of faculty that were guiding us through this experience. So, of course, we had an amazing group of undergrads. This is always one of my favorite pieces by Brian Alfred. He was in the BFA program with me, as was Mike Christie and Gerald Davis and Barbara Campbell. So that was the type of work. It was actually a very diverse body of work. So I was making small figurative paintings. I actually don't have a lot of work in here from that time period, but it was fairly realistic. Groups of people sort of lost and looking at computers and things. So like Anne said, I have a BFA in painting and a Bachelor of Science in Art Education with a museums option. I did my junior year abroad at Temple University, Rome. It was Tyler School of Art painting program, really. And I did internships with the cultural advisor to Governor Casey in Harrisburg, the State Museum in Harrisburg, the Palmer, actually with Glenn Williamson, who is now at the University of Florida, head of their museum program, the Mattress Factory in Pittsburgh, and the Carnegie Museum of Art. So after doing those internships, I got a job at Carnegie Mellon University. I was doing design for them and also administering their grad program, their faculty and tenure. And Stellark was in residence when I was there. Steve Kurtz from Critical Art Ensemble. All these amazing graduate students, they were collaborating with computer science and robotics. And so at that point, I really started to get obsessed with art and technology crossovers. So my boss in Pittsburgh recommended that I move to California. And so in 1998, I moved to California, taught high school there for a bit, and then eventually went to grad school there, working with people like Barbara Kruger, Lev Manovich, Grant Kester, just amazing, amazing people. So before I went to graduate school, I taught overseas at a couple different places. The first place was Bahrain. Bahrain is a little tiny island off the coast of Saudi Arabia. The Fifth Fleet, the U.S. Fifth Fleet, is often stationed there. Also, it was a British protectorate, so it's just this sea of expatriates within the Middle East. So at that time, I was still painting, doing like sort of figurative painting, but becoming obsessed with pattern. Also, I was starting to take a lot of video. So I thought, okay, if I'm working from photographs to make these paintings, why don't I take video? And then there's 30 frames per second that I can pull from, and I can get that exact moment that I want. But I also started editing video quite a bit. So I'm not going to show any of those early videos. I'm going to focus mostly on the more recent work. But just so you know that that's about when that started. And I became really obsessed with patterns. I mean, there were patterns everywhere in the Middle East. on the tables, inside domes. And I guess what mesmerized me about the patterns was they had this sort of predictable order and this implication of like divinity controlling everything and making everything okay. But I was there 2000 to 2002, so it was during September 11th. My students were protesting and setting off like firecrackers and stuff to scare the teachers. It was a strange time to see that sort of order-chaos contrast. So I was so profoundly affected by those experiences that I went back to California for graduate school and I made work about those expatriates. So my graduate work investigated the expat experience. And this is a quote from Eva Hoffman. She's a Polish-American writer and a Guggenheim winner. And she writes a lot about transnational moves, and she describes them as having abrupt ruptures, and that they're powerful narrative shapers with a stark sense of biographical drama that often manifests in intense creative outpourings. So Edward Said talks about how, some of the greatest names in the Western canon were immigrants and refugees. And so I was curious about what that looked like in that time, mid, 2003, 2004, those types of things. So when I was in graduate school, I would design these patterns, print them out on like a double matte film, like sort of a thick vellum, and then I would cut these figures, these like silhouettes of figures cut up in balls of architecture. And when I did a studio visit with Ellen Gallagher, she liked them because from far away they looked like these abject objects. But then when you got up close, you could see they were like finely controlled, purposefully cut, these paper cuts. And so in fall of 2004, I got to go to Beijing for 6 months, and I did a project there in the Deshanze Art District. And there's this amazing gallery run by Liu Jie that was called the Long March Space. And he had traveled through Beijing and asked people to, like every single person in a village, to make a paper cut. So it could be like a young teenager or a woman that was like 65 or 83 or, and they would all make these paper cuts. So in the spirit of like sort of Suzanne Lacey's crystal quilt, I asked women to come together in that space and then collaboratively make these sort of paper cuts. And they also talked into microphones, and it was projected into that space. Deshanze Art District is kind of this amazing place if you get to visit. It's in these old Eastern German ammunitions and electronic factories that have this Bauhaus design that's really beautiful, and they've all been changed into contemporary art spaces. So after graduate school, I moved to Florida to teach at Florida State University. And as soon as I got there, I started thinking about the Florida landscape. It was so very different than the California landscape. And this is an early collaborative piece I did with my husband, Owen Mundy. And it was the first time I did any sort of like generative art. So basically in March, it's pretty warm, and there's this sea of pollen that's released from the trees. So the piece basically cycles through each day of the month and then links up to data that has the pollen like increases, the sprites increase as it cycles through the month as it relates to that data. So because of my interest in generative art, I did a residency at Anderson Branch with Josh Davis. This is Josh, you can't see his face, but holding up one of his artworks. So he at the time, he was using Flash to rearrange and color objects in a way that he would set up the parameters, he would design the objects, and then he would release control based on how the computer would actually place where the objects went. And I was really interested in that kind of work. So basically, you could control the colors. You would tell it, like, these are all the colors that you might strip from a photograph. And then you could, sort of set up the background and then let the computer just sort of place the objects as it would. So from those studies, I would do some paintings that were like line drawings and ink on vellum, this close up. And then the recession hit, and I was thinking a lot about the opposite of the expat experience, like sort of being forced to root myself in Florida, which is this like swampy environment, just sort of sucks you in. So I was longing for California and sort of looking at some of the houses there, and I was going through foreclosed home databases and then looking the houses up on Google Street View. And Google Street View is just amazing the way it warps imagery. Like you get a lot of these objects that just sort of curve to the center, or you get these big lens flares that are kind of interesting. And so I started doing, drawing these warping housing structures that were floating, and then still using that software to like rearrange them. But I hated the colors. The colors were like an Easter egg or something. I had stripped them from a photograph I had taken in Colorado, but I wasn't happy with it. So I did a lot of research into color, and I discovered these things called color forecasts, which maybe some of you have heard their relationship to the fashion industry. But Sherwin-Williams, they also have color forecasts that they put on their website. And I found these ones that were recommended just before the bubble burst, the housing bubble burst. And they had amazing names like Balanced Living. And within that color forecast, there were names like Inland or Raindrop or Exclusive Plum. Here's another one from that same year, Sultry Origins, Gingery, Pennywise, and Fine Wine. So indeed, you would be pennywise if you bought these paints, covered your house in them, and then you could have this brilliant investment, supposedly. So I used those to color the housing fragments, and that made a lot more sense. So again, I could generate them very quickly and pick the best ones. So I would just like sort of flip through, pressing the spacebar key, and then decide which ones I like. It was about that time that Brian came to visit, Brian Alfred, and he was like, oh, these really remind me of Katamari Damacy. And I had never played that before, but it totally makes sense. I mean, it's the same instinct. So does anybody know that game? Yeah? Can you describe to the others what it's all about? Go ahead.
Essentially, the main character is this wee tiny little prince, and your dad is the king of the cosmos.
Of course.
And your dad gets super drunk one night and destroys all of the stars and the moon and everything.
Yeah.
So what your job is to go down to Earth with this ball called a Katamari and just roll things up and make the ball bigger and bigger. And then the king puts it into space and ignites it.
Yeah.
And makes a star out of it.
And that was perfect for me when we were dealing with the housing bubble. Like that there were these financial wise men, the quants, in control of the market, and they set up these systems where it would be mortgages that were bought and sold and repackaged and bought, sold and repackaged. So it became so distant from the people that were living in it. So this use of an automated system within my studio practice just made so much sense for that imagery. So I produced an edition of 5 with 27 unique prints. I also made an animation where I scraped data and sort of merged it together. I'm not really going to show that here, but it just sort of flickers and it's kind of beautiful and cycles through the color forecasts. And it was that point I went to Berlin, Germany for a year to do a DAD fellowship, which is this amazing thing. It's like the German version of the Fulbright. And if anybody wants to hear about it, please let me know, because it's this really incredible opportunity to go to places like Berlin. Are these really washed out, or is it? Yeah. I think there's something about the projector, it's a little, but these are, I went to the Berlin's wintry landscape. I made all these delicate drawings of the local architecture. The thing I'd written my DAAD for was to visit the Bauhaus archive and look at how consumer desire was manufactured in post-World War Berlin through color and design. And it was such a productive year. So I'm going to jump forward to a paper I just gave at the CAA conference called Hacking Systems, Flexing Failure, because I feel like it's the best review of what happened next in my career. And this is where I want to focus most of the talk. So my husband and I, the work that we've been collaborating on, we just released a catalog. And the essay is actually by Eduardo Navas, who teaches here, so that's kind of exciting. He went to UCSD for his PhD. And so the focus of that body of work is on packet switching. Does anybody know what packet switching is? No, it's basically like telecommunication systems use packet switching, almost all of them. And so they divide, if I'm sending a picture of my 4-year-old daughter to my brother in Burbank in California, it will divide that, something as simple as a JPEG, into data packets, and then part of it might go up through, through a network through Chicago, and then another through Texas, and then it's reassembled on the other side. So this idea of taking a whole and then having automated systems dividing it and then bringing it back together, and then asking questions about what happens when systems fail, which is what the housing thing was about, that all made sense to me. So the catalog covers a commission from the city of Kassel during Documenta 13. It was just another temporary wall painting. And that commission grew out of these large temporary paintings that I was doing the previous year. So the Sherwin series prints that I showed you before, I kind of loved that they were small and I could sort of like wrap my arms around them, but they felt like they needed to be bigger. So the paintings that I did, I decided to do it directly on the wall with the house paint that inspired the series. And then they were temporary, just sort of like how most people's relationship is to their housing anymore. And it just made sense. So this was one in Jacksonville, Florida. This is one at Soho 20 Gallery in Chelsea. And I really loved with these, how they were like pushing up against the actual architecture of the space. That also felt super important to me. So I would project these and then I would paint them directly on the wall. And then, after a month or 6 months, depending on how long the show was up, the gallery would paint them white again. And I was totally okay with that. It's not a super sustainable practice, but I've somehow managed to pull it off. So this was one piece with the animation. It was part of a show at Montserrat College of Art. It was called Remote Access, Data as Art, with Casey Rees and George LaGrady, a couple other data artists. I don't even feel like a data artist. I mean, I still am always finding excuses to paint, Like I love new media. I love all of its possibilities, but I always feel like I'm trying to find ways to come back to paint because of that making magic out of mud type of thing. So to expand the series for the City of Kassel Commission, I invited artist Owen Mundy, my husband, to develop 2 pieces of custom software, one that worked with 3D models, whereas before I was just working with 2D models. So we used processing to sort of like work these models. And the models in this case was the Bauhaus de Salle, which was the first architectural school, and also sort of the foundation for a lot of modern architecture. And the building where the exhibition took place was the apartment registration for the city of Kassel. So it all just sort of like came together. And it's also using a color palette called High Velocity from that year. So I keep coming back to the color palettes. So what began as a request for technical help developed into a robust, ongoing collaboration, a history that we detail at length in the current issue of Media In on Art and Infrastructures. So that's available online, or you can get a print version. So our research began with the examination of the growth of automation in manufacturing, space, and form. And so we looked at early examples of that, and one of the ones that captured our imagination were the Sears catalog homes from 1908 to 1940, where you could actually, order a house through Sears, and it would come, and it was like you just put it together. It's like the most beautiful thing that you could actually order this simple thing. And those types of ideas were based on efficiency studies, such as the Frankfurt Kitchen. All of those ideas came out of the Bauhaus. So this idea of increased systemization of everyday objects is what fascinated me. So developments in hardware and software, the way they systemize our everyday environment and the way those environments fail is really interesting to me. So, for example, if you're traveling to an airport and like the systems fall apart, like what do? You're trapped in this weird, space. Yeah. In fact, before I gave this talk at CAA, I was in a taxi coming from the airport, and none of my cards were working. So I couldn't get out of the taxi, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't have any cash on me. So it was like I was like trapped in this yellow box, and I didn't, because the systems were failing. And I went into the hotel, and all of my cards were working fine. It just happened to be in that one warped space, this code space. There's two geographers, Rob Kitchen and Martin Dodge. That's how they describe those spaces, code spaces. And I think that's it's something I think a lot about in regards to my work. So there's a UK theorist, James Brindle, who also talks about code spaces and their potential to break down. So he gives Amazon warehouses as a perfect example. So it's like impossible to find anything in an Amazon warehouse unless you have some of their gadgets, And so what I'm thinking a lot about, like what those interactions are. So there were a couple people I wanted to talk about in light of those code spaces, people that are really influencing me right now. Just a slight segue, and then I'll talk about the rest of the work. So I was attracted to people like Tacita Dean and Carrie Tribe. And Tacita Dean, because of her sort of insistence to stick with film in light of all the digital media stuff. And the way that she did this film, JG, specifically, it's supposed to be a conversation between J.D. Ballard and Robert Smithson. And the way that she created this was to expose, she has this patented system of apertures that she 3D prints, and then she makes a shape, and she exposes the film one time through, and then she makes the opposite of like the negative space, an aperture that will allow the film to be exposed in the negative space. So it's just this elaborate, very difficult system. And I think it's just absurd when you could do this so easily with digital stuff. It amazes me that she goes to those lengths. Also related to system failure, I'm really interested in Carrie Tribe's work. This is a piece called HM from 2009. It was a double projection of a single 16 millimeter film that's looping between the two projectors. And it's talking about this famous amnesiac who he had sort of he had surgery, and then it impaired his memory, so he could only remember the last 20 seconds. And then he would forget everything else. So you get this really sort of beautiful delay in her work through those two projectors. So Carrie Tribe talks about other systems failure, like The Last Soviet from 2010, which was a looping 10-minute video that tells the story of a Russian cosmonaut who was stranded up, orbiting the Earth in the Mir space station for 311 days as the Soviet Union collapsed. So just this idea, again, of the systems failure. So she has a lot of this type of like glitched video, and she even shows like footage of Swan Lake that was shown whenever people were, whenever there were protests in the news, they would sort of block out those protests by showing something as beautiful as Swan Lake. And the final example of finding the sublime in systems breaking down, I present Hollis Frampton's 1971 film called Critical Mass, which Carrie Tribe just restaged as a live performance at the Tate Modern and MoMA. And so it shows just a couple, they're having this fight, and it's so disrupted and like stuttering naturally because of their argument. Then he, as a structuralist filmmaker, he sort of restructures the film so the stuttering is even more pronounced. So I think those are really great examples when I think about breaking down systems. And in this case, this piece, which was a commission at the University of Florida, the system was the architecture of the building. So the architecture, let me see if I don't have it. So basically it was for the College of Communication and Journalism, and they redesigned this big building so that they had what was called a convergence newsroom. So basically the idea is the New York Times and PR, everyone is going to this idea of a convergence newsroom where you generate the content in a central location, and then you send it out to the different types of media outlet, like newspaper, radio, print, whatever. So we took the actual building, wrote software so that it would break it into fragments, but not in a way we could control it. And then we basically used those fragments and some of the code, the source code for those fragments, in the design that we made for the building. So this is still there. It's a permanent public art commission. I used that same Sherwin-Williams 2012 color forecast called High Velocity, which was really fortunate because there were TVs in the space that the design had to fight with. And that's the only type of this sort of like highlighter green and highlighter pink fighting with those television monitors. I think that's the only thing that we could pull off in that space. So then we used that same software that fragmented the architecture in an installation in Washington, D.C. And we used a lot of the buildings within Washington, D.C., some of the public administration buildings, and as well as some homes that we found. What I found with Washington, D.C. is that it's not, there's not much foreclosure, but there's a lot of turnover. I mean, you can imagine with politicians, and it's a very transient population. So the animations that we did were just sort of tumbling over one another, these architectural forms, and then it also had scraped data from the foreclosed home websites. So here's a still from the animation. So every time, it's generative, so every time we run it, it's different. And as the Washington Post described the animated projections, a few elements will be recognizable, such as the brutalist outline of the J. Edgar Hoover FBI building, but many are stripped down to their most generic shapes, making rows of windows look like charts and bar graphs. The projections of some of the shapes echo the interplay and the forms of the Flashpoint Gallery interior. So at the beginning of the year, we used that same software in an installation at the Orlando Museum of Art, and then also at the Florida State Museum of Fine Arts. And when we created this artwork, basically the way that we did it, the boards are completely virtual and they're sort of like levitating above this construction site. It's easier to see when you actually see the installation. And the construction site was one of many in the United States that, you know, it was a huge development. They laid out the roads, they put in the water system, and then everything came to a full stop when the recession hit. So it was just sitting there on the drive from Tallahassee to Orlando. So we took shots of it, and then we put that back behind these sort of this levitating mass of boards that were rotating. So when we created this artwork, I thought of Tony Smith's 1951 unfinished section of New Jersey Turnpike. And it's sort of this famous story, and the story goes like this. One night in 1951, Smith found himself in a car riding with 3 students from Cooper Union, riding down a not yet open New Jersey Turnpike. They made this illicit trip from exit 16 to 9 with no street lamps, lane markers, or guardrails, relying only on their headlights and the industrial glow of North Jersey. In a now famous Art Forum interview conducted 15 years later, Smith described this drive as a revelation, raising questions about the division between art and life. Oh, and there, that was supposed to be up while I was reading that. Okay, here we go. The road and much of the landscape was artificial, he said. And yet, it could not be called a work of art. On the other hand, it did something for me that art has never done. At first, I did not know what it was, but its effect was to liberate me from the many views I had about art. So, I think it's those types of spaces that I'm thinking a lot about, like the potential systems failure that we can't predict. But like, for example, with the flash crash of 2000, where the stock market just stopped for like 5 seconds, like time stopped. I'm really interested in those types of moments and trying to depict those moments. So that's my presentation. So if you have any questions, this is a whole body of work I didn't show you, but it was inspired by these levitating figures, underwater hockey players. I had no idea there was such a thing. So I thought I would end there and let you watch the underwater field hockey players. So thanks for having me.
Joel.
Yeah.